Welcome to one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of antebellum Mississippi. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. The year was 1849, when a notice appeared in the Natchez Weekly Courier that would go unnoticed by most readers, but would mark the beginning of an incomprehensible mystery. The advertisement sought information regarding two young women, formerly enslaved at separate estates over 200 miles apart, who had been identified as identical twins named Dinah and Delilah Crane, separated at auction in 1837 when they were merely 9 years old. When these sisters were finally reunited at a freedmen's settlement through the efforts of abolition networks, witnesses would document something that defied all rational explanation. For while one twin had remained unchanged, the other had become something that no longer seemed entirely human. To understand what transpired in those 12 intervening years requires returning to that spring day in 1837, when the twins first stood upon the auction block in Natchez, their fate bound to the financial collapse of the Hartwell estate, which had fallen into bankruptcy following a series of failed cotton harvests and mounting debts. Court records preserved in the Adams County Courthouse and examined during a historical survey in 1961 detail the proceedings of April 15, 1837, when the entire Hartwell property, including 73 enslaved individuals, was liquidated to satisfy creditors. Among the documents is the auctioneer's ledger, which notes in careful script the sale of 2 female children, 9 years of age, identical in appearance, with matching marks upon their left shoulders, sold separately despite their pleas to remain together. Dinah was purchased for $280 by William Brennan, owner of a moderate cotton plantation in Adams County, known for relatively humane treatment of those he enslaved, while Delilah was acquired for $315 by Dr. Silas Mordecai, a reclusive physician who maintained a remote estate in Claiborne County and whose reasons for attending the auction that day would later become the subject of dark speculation. A letter discovered in 1923, tucked within the pages of a merchant's account book, describes witnessing the auction and the twins' desperate attempts to hold on to one another as they were separated, the writer calling it an unnatural severing that haunted him for years afterward. Dinah's arrival at the Brennan plantation in Adams County marked the beginning of a period that would be meticulously documented through the household records maintained by William Brennan, and more intimately, through the personal diary of his wife, Martha Brennan, which was donated to the Mississippi Department of Archives and History by a descendant in 1954. The plantation itself, consisting of approximately 400 acres of cotton fields worked by 32 enslaved individuals, was considered among the more moderately operated estates in the region, a distinction that carried little comfort for those held in bondage, but which perhaps explained Dinah's survival with her spirit, if not her happiness, relatively intact. Martha Brennan's diary entries from the period between 1837 and 1840 paint a portrait of a child of remarkable intelligence who learned to read and write by studying the discarded primers and copybooks of the Brennan children, a skill Martha quietly encouraged despite the legal prohibitions against educating enslaved individuals. An entry dated November 12, 1839, describes Dinah as possessing a mind as sharp as any I have encountered, yet perpetually shrouded in a melancholy that no kindness seems able to penetrate, noting that the girl would often stand at the eastern edge of the property, staring toward the horizon, as though she could see through distance and circumstance to wherever her sister might be. The depth of Dinah's longing for her twin was not fully understood until 1967, when renovations to the former Brennan house, by then divided into apartments, revealed a letter tucked inside a gap in the wall behind what had once been the kitchen. The letter, preserved by the dry conditions within the wall cavity and now held in a private collection, is written in a careful, unpracticed hand and dated March 3rd, 1840. Addressed to Delilah though never sent, the letter speaks of Dinah's determination to find her sister, her belief that they would be reunited, and her nightly prayers that Delilah was being treated with mercy at whatever plantation held her. The letter concludes with a promise that Dinah would not rest until they stood together again, a promise that would take 9 more years, and the intervention of abolition networks to fulfill, by which time the sister Dinah sought would be transformed beyond recognition. While Dinah's life at the Brennan plantation unfolded with relative documentation, her sister's existence at the Mordecai estate in Claiborne County remained shrouded in an obscurity that was itself disturbing, with information about those years emerging only through fragmentary evidence pieced together by researchers decades later. County tax records preserved in the Claiborne County Courthouse reveal that Dr. Silas Mordecai maintained a property of approximately 250 acres, significantly smaller than neighboring plantations, with tax assessments indicating ownership of fewer than 20 enslaved individuals throughout the period from 1837 to 1847. Dr. Mordecai himself was a figure of mystery and speculation among his neighbors, having arrived in Claiborne County in 1835 after abandoning a medical practice in New Orleans under circumstances that remained unclear, though correspondence between neighboring plantation owners, discovered in various family archives during the 1970s, hints at rumors of experimental procedures and questions about his methods that had circulated in New Orleans medical circles. The isolated nature of the Mordecai estate, positioned at the end of a long approach road and surrounded by dense woods that obscured it from casual observation, contributed to an atmosphere of unease that several contemporary accounts reference obliquely. The most direct description comes from the journal of Reverend Samuel Hawthorne, a circuit preacher who traveled through Claiborne County ministering to enslaved populations on various plantations, whose personal papers were discovered in a church archive in Lexington, Kentucky in 1945. His entry, dated June 22, 1838, describes arriving at the Mordecai property to offer spiritual guidance to the enslaved individuals there, only to be refused entry by Dr. Mordecai himself, who claimed his workers were under a special medical quarantine and could not receive visitors of any kind. Reverend Hawthorne's journal notes that this explanation seemed dubious given the lack of any reported illness in the area, and he describes standing at the property's entrance at dusk, hearing what he termed most unsettling sounds, cries that seemed neither wholly human nor animal, emanating from somewhere deep within the estate. Sounds that caused him to depart with a profound sense of unease and a conviction that something unholy transpired behind the walls of that isolated plantation. The first concrete indication that something profoundly wrong was occurring at the Mordecai estate emerged in March of 1840, when 3 enslaved individuals listed in Dr. Mordecai's property records vanished from the plantation under circumstances that would not be fully examined until researchers began investigating the case more than a century later. Sheriff's records from Claiborne County, reviewed during a historical survey conducted in 1958, show that on March 18, 1840, Dr. Mordecai reported 3 of his workers as runaways, providing descriptions and requesting their capture and return according to the standard procedures of the time. The official record treated this as an unremarkable occurrence, as enslaved individuals attempting to escape bondage was common enough to warrant little investigation beyond the posting of notices and rewards. However, correspondence between neighboring plantation owners discovered in a trunk of family papers during an estate sale in 1958 reveals that several of Dr. Mordecai's neighbors harbored significant doubts about this explanation. A letter dated April 2, 1840, from plantation owner Richard Thornton to his brother in Natchez describes noticing smoke rising from an unusual structure on Mordecai's property, far removed from the main house and slave quarters, a building Thornton had not previously observed, and which seemed to have no obvious agricultural purpose. Another letter, this one from a neighboring widow named Catherine Mills, mentions in passing that Dr. Mordecai had been receiving regular shipments from a medical supply company in New Orleans, deliveries that arrived with surprising frequency for a man who no longer practiced medicine publicly. The full extent of these shipments remained unknown until 1972, when a fire at a New Orleans warehouse prompted the salvage and cataloguing of historical documents stored there, including manifests from a defunct medical supply company that had operated in the 1830s and 1840s. Among these manifests were records of shipments to Dr. S. Mordecai of Claiborne County, detailing orders that included substantial quantities of laudanum, chloroform, surgical instruments of various types, leather restraints reinforced with iron buckles, and other items that far exceeded any legitimate medical need for a retired physician on a small plantation, suggesting instead preparations for procedures of a nature that the manifest keeper could not have imagined. As Dinah entered her early teenage years, a phenomenon began that Martha Brennan would document with increasing concern in her diary entries between 1840 and 1843, a series of experiences that suggested a connection between the separated twins that transcended the physical distance dividing them. The first recorded instance appears in Martha's diary entry of July 8, 1840, which describes Dinah waking the household with screams in the night, a pattern that would repeat with disturbing frequency over the following years. These episodes, which Martha termed night terrors of an unusual intensity, involved Dinah waking in a state of profound distress, speaking of her sister being held in darkness, of hands that hurt her, of procedures she could not name but which filled her with overwhelming dread. An entry from January 1841 notes that Dinah had become increasingly withdrawn, often clutching her arms as though in pain, though no injuries were visible, and pleading with Martha to help her understand what was happening to Delilah. Concerned by the intensity and persistence of these episodes, William Brennan arranged for Dr. Benjamin Carter, a physician from Natchez, to examine Dinah in March of 1841. Dr. Carter's medical notes, preserved in a family collection that was donated to the Mississippi Historical Society in 1989, describe his findings in terms that reveal both his puzzlement and his unease. He writes that the girl exhibits signs of what he terms a sympathetic affliction, as though she suffers phantom pains from wounds she does not herself bear, noting that she would flinch and cry out when he examined certain areas of her body, despite showing no physical injury or illness that would account for such reactions. Dr. Carter speculated that the trauma of separation from her twin had created a form of melancholia that manifested in physical symptoms, though he admitted this explanation felt inadequate to explain the specificity and consistency of Dinah's distress. Martha's diary entries from this period reveal Dinah's increasingly desperate pleas to be allowed to search for her sister, her conviction that Delilah was suffering terribly, and her anguished frustration that no one would believe the connection she felt or act upon her warnings that something unspeakable was happening to her twin in that distant, unknown place. The true nature of what occurred within the isolated confines of the Mordecai estate during those years would remain unknown until 1934, when a journal attributed to Dr. Silas Mordecai was discovered in the abandoned library of a defunct medical college in Mobile, Alabama, during the building's demolition. The journal, bound in leather and containing entries spanning from 1838 to 1846, was donated to the University of Alabama archives, where it remains, its contents so disturbing that access requires special permission from the Historical Research Committee. Written primarily in medical Latin, with passages in a coded shorthand that took researchers years to partially decipher, the journal reveals Dr. Mordecai's obsession with what he termed the scientific study of human tolerance thresholds and behavioral modification through controlled application of physical and psychological stimuli. The entries describe experiments conducted on subjects identified only by numbers, detailing his investigations into pain response, nerve sensitivity, the effects of prolonged isolation, and what he called the malleability of human consciousness under sustained duress. While Dr. Mordecai never explicitly identifies his subjects, cross-referencing the ages and physical descriptions mentioned in his clinical notes with his plantation records suggests these experiments were conducted upon the enslaved individuals under his absolute control, including children. One entry dated August 14, 1842, describes with chilling clinical detachment an extended experiment on subject number 7, a female of approximately 14 years, involving cycles of sensory deprivation in a darkened chamber, followed by the systematic administration of various compounds, including laudanum, chloroform, and experimental mixtures of his own devising, with observations recorded regarding the subject's diminishing responses to external stimuli and what Dr. Mordecai termed the progressive dissolution of volitional behavior. The physical description and age of subject number 7 corresponds precisely to what Delilah Crane would have been in 1842, 4 years into her captivity on the Mordecai estate. The journal entries continue in this manner for several more years, documenting procedures that modern psychological researchers who have examined the text describe as systematic torture designed to study the breaking points of human consciousness. Experiments that were made possible only by the complete power slavery granted Dr. Mordecai over those he held in bondage, and whose suffering he recorded with the dispassionate precision of a man studying insects rather than human beings. By 1843, the unease that had long existed as whispered speculation among Dr. Mordecai's neighbors began to coalesce into more concrete expressions of concern, documented in correspondence and church records that would be discovered by researchers examining Claiborne County archives in 1951. Letters between plantation owners from this period, preserved in various family collections, reference troubling rumors about the Mordecai estate, with several writers mentioning enslaved individuals who had escaped from his property and arrived at neighboring plantations in states of profound psychological distress, speaking in fragmented accounts of a master who conducted what they termed unholy practices in a building separate from the main house. The most formal expression of these concerns came in 1844, when 3 neighboring plantation owners, Robert Sinclair, James Whitfield, and Thomas Pemberton, submitted a petition to the Claiborne County Sheriff requesting an official investigation of the Mordecai property. The petition, discovered in county archives during a 1951 survey, cites multiple incidents of concern, including the testimonies of escaped individuals and the observation that Dr. Mordecai's enslaved population seemed to decrease without corresponding sale records appearing in public documents. Attached to this petition was a testimony recorded by Reverend Marcus Sullivan, a Methodist minister who had documented the account of a woman who escaped from the Mordecai estate in late 1843 and sought refuge at the Sinclair plantation. Reverend Sullivan's notes describe a woman of approximately 25 years bearing unusual scars upon her scalp and exhibiting behavior he termed possessed, though he clarified his belief that her condition resulted from earthly torment rather than supernatural influence, noting that she would become catatonic when questioned about her experiences, and would repeat only that the doctor had taken something from inside her head. The petition concludes with a request for immediate investigation and intervention. Yet, a marginal note written in a different hand, presumably by a county official, indicates the matter was dismissed without investigation, with the notation that Dr. Mordecai's family maintained connections to prominent figures in state government, and that accusations from enslaved individuals held no legal standing to warrant official action against a white property owner of good social standing. In September of 1845, Dinah Crane disappeared from the Brennan plantation, an event that appeared at first to be a typical case of an enslaved person fleeing bondage, with advertisements placed in the Natchez Courier seeking information leading to her return, copies of which can be found in archived newspapers from that period held by the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. The advertisements describe Dinah as approximately 17 years of age, of medium height and build, literate, and last seen wearing a brown homespun dress, with a reward of $50 offered for her capture and return. What these advertisements didn't reveal, and what would not become known until 2003, when a collection of letters written by Underground Railroad conductors was donated to the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center in Cincinnati, was that Dinah was not fleeing northward toward freedom, but traveling eastward with a singular, desperate purpose. A letter dated October 1845, written by a conductor who signed only with the initial J, describes encountering a young woman on a rural road, approximately 60 miles west of Claiborne County, who identified herself as seeking her twin sister held on a plantation near Port Gibson. The conductor, recognizing Dinah as a fugitive and understanding the grave danger she faced, attempted to convince her to abandon her search and continue north to safety. But his letter notes that she refused with a determination that bordered on madness, insisting that her sister was in mortal danger and that she felt her suffering across the distance that separated them. The letter describes Dinah as suffering from severe exposure and exhaustion, having traveled on foot for over a week with minimal food or rest, yet remaining fixated solely on reaching the Mordecai estate despite having no plan for what she would do upon arrival. The conductor's efforts to dissuade her proved unsuccessful, and Dinah continued eastward, only to be captured by a patrol within 10 miles of her destination on September 28, 1845. Court records from Adams County document her return to the Brennan plantation, with William Brennan paying $22 in fees and compensation to the men who captured her, an expense he recorded in his account books, alongside a notation expressing regret at the necessity of Dinah's punishment for her attempted flight. In September of 1845, Dinah Crane disappeared from the Brennan plantation, an event that appeared at first to be a typical case of an enslaved person fleeing bondage, with advertisements placed in the Natchez Courier seeking information leading to her return, copies of which can be found in archived newspapers from that period held by the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. The advertisements describe Dinah as approximately 17 years of age, of medium height and build, literate, and last seen wearing a brown homespun dress, with a reward of $50 offered for her capture and return. What these advertisements didn't reveal, and what would not become known until 2003, when a collection of letters written by Underground Railroad conductors was donated to the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center in Cincinnati, was that Dinah was not fleeing northward toward freedom, but traveling eastward with a singular, desperate purpose. A letter dated October 1845, written by a conductor who signed only with the initial J, describes encountering a young woman on a rural road, approximately 60 miles west of Claiborne. County, who identified herself as seeking her twin sister, held on a plantation near Port Gibson. The conductor, recognizing Dinah as a fugitive and understanding the grave danger she faced, attempted to convince her to abandon her search and continue north to safety. But his letter notes that she refused with a determination that bordered on madness, insisting that her sister was in mortal danger and that she felt her suffering across the distance that separated them. The letter describes Dinah as suffering from severe exposure and exhaustion, having traveled on foot for over a week with minimal food or rest, yet remaining fixated solely on reaching the Mordecai estate, despite having no plan for what she would do upon arrival. The conductor's efforts to dissuade her proved unsuccessful, and Dinah continued eastward, only to be captured by a patrol within 10 miles of her destination on September the 28th, 1845. Court records from Adams County document her return to the Brennan plantation, with William Brennan paying $22 in fees and compensation to the men who captured her, an expense he recorded in his account books, alongside a notation expressing regret at the necessity of Dinah's punishment for her attempted flight. Dr. Silas Mordecai died on June 11, 1847, under circumstances that the county coroner described in his brief report, preserved in Claiborne County records, as unusual, though not overtly suspicious, noting that the physician appeared to have suffered a seizure or apoplectic fit while alone in his study. His body discovered by one of his remaining workers 2 days after his death. The estate inventory conducted for probate proceedings, discovered during a comprehensive survey of courthouse records in 1962, reveals a property that had fallen into considerable neglect and disrepair, with the main house described as sparsely furnished and the outbuildings in various states of deterioration. Most significantly, the inventory lists only 7 enslaved individuals remaining on the property, all adults ranging in age from 28 to 45, a number that stood in stark contrast to tax records and purchase receipts, indicating that Dr. Mordecai had acquired at least 15 enslaved individuals over the previous decade, including several children. The fate of the missing 8 individuals is not addressed in any official documentation, their disappearance from the records as complete as if they had never existed. The estate executor, a lawyer named Harrison Caldwell, appointed by the court to manage Mordecai's affairs, completed his inventory with professional efficiency, but a letter he wrote to Dr. Mordecai's relatives in New Orleans, discovered in a private family collection in 1981, reveals that the official inventory omitted certain disturbing findings. The letter, dated June 28, 1847, describes Caldwell's discovery of a locked cellar beneath the isolated outbuilding on the property, a space that required the services of a blacksmith to gain entry after keys could not be located. Inside, Caldwell reported finding medical equipment of a most troubling nature, including restraint devices, surgical instruments bearing stains he preferred not to contemplate, and detailed notes describing procedures that the executor stated he could not in good conscience describe in writing, expressing only that he had immediately ordered the cellar and its contents sealed, and had recommended to Mordecai's relatives that the structure be destroyed entirely before the property was sold, lest its discoveries bring unwanted scrutiny to the family name. Following Dr. Mordecai's death and the completion of the estate inventory, the 7 remaining enslaved individuals on his property were sold at auction in August of 1847, a proceeding documented in the Claiborne County Court records and noted in several newspaper advertisements from that period. By this time, abolitionist networks had become increasingly active in Mississippi, despite the considerable dangers they faced, with agents working covertly to purchase the freedom of enslaved individuals whenever circumstances permitted such intervention. Through a complex arrangement involving intermediaries and funds provided by the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society, 2 of the individuals from the Mordecai estate were purchased and granted their freedom. Among them, a young woman of approximately 19 years, identified in the auction records as Delilah. The logistics of transporting these newly freed individuals northward through the Underground Railroad network was documented in correspondence preserved in the papers of the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society, now held at the Boston Public Library. A particularly revealing account, written in March of 1848 by a conductor, identified only as T.W., describes receiving Delilah at a safe house in Kentucky and being profoundly unsettled by her condition in ways that differed from the trauma he had observed in other escaped or freed individuals. The conductor writes that while Delilah appeared physically whole, showing no signs of recent injury or illness, she exhibited what he termed a complete absence of natural human affect, moving only when explicitly directed to do so, speaking only when directly questioned, and then in brief, flat responses devoid of emotion or inflection. Most disturbing to the conductor was her gaze, which he described as containing a terrible emptiness, as though she looked not at the world around her, but through it, her eyes reflecting an absence rather than a presence, as if something fundamental to human consciousness had been extracted from her through whatever procedures she had endured during her years at the Mordecai estate. The conductor noted his unsuccessful attempts to engage her in conversation about her experiences or her plans for the future, receiving only silence or single-word responses, and his growing conviction that whatever Dr. Mordecai had done to this young woman had damaged her in ways that went beyond physical torture into territories of psychological destruction he had no framework to comprehend. Dinah's years of bondage came to an unexpected end in December of 1848, when William and Martha Brennan, in a decision documented in Adams County manumission records, discovered during a comprehensive survey of antebellum legal documents in 1975, granted her freedom through a formal deed of emancipation. While the legal document provides no explanation for this decision beyond the standard language required by Mississippi law, correspondence between Martha Brennan and her sister in Mobile, found among family papers in 1982, suggests that Martha's conscience had been increasingly troubled by Dinah's continued enslavement, particularly given the girl's obvious intelligence and the years of anguish Martha had witnessed following her separation from her twin. Newly freed and now 20 years of age, Dinah made her way northward to a freedmen's settlement near Nashville, Tennessee, where abolitionist networks maintained an active presence, providing assistance to those recently escaped from or released from bondage. It was through these networks, which maintained communication channels between various settlements and safe houses, that word reached Dinah in early 1849 that her sister Delilah had been located and was residing at another settlement approximately 80 miles distant. Letters exchanged between members of the abolitionist organizations coordinating this reunion, preserved in the archives of Oberlin College and examined by researchers in 1987, reveal that the anticipated meeting was viewed with both hope and considerable trepidation by those who had been caring for Delilah. One letter dated March 1849, written by an organizer identified as Sarah Mathers, notes with obvious concern that Delilah's condition had shown no improvement despite months of freedom, adequate nutrition, medical attention, and the supportive environment of the settlement, describing her as remaining in a state of profound disconnection from her surroundings and from her own self. The letter expresses hope that the reunion with her twin sister might somehow restore what years of trauma had taken from her, that the bond between the sisters might reach through whatever darkness imprisoned Delilah's consciousness and return her to herself. Though Mathers admits this hope feels increasingly desperate given the complete absence of progress they had observed in Delilah's recovery. The reunion between Dinah and Delilah Crane occurred on April 17, 1849, at a freedmen's settlement approximately 15 miles north of Nashville, Tennessee, an event witnessed by multiple individuals whose accounts were compiled by abolitionist organizations documenting the conditions and experiences of freed enslaved people for publication in their periodicals and reports. 3 separate written testimonies, preserved in the archives, of the American Anti-Slavery Society and examined by researchers in 1991, describe the scene with remarkable consistency, despite being recorded by different observers. The first account, written by settlement coordinator Rebecca Harding, describes Dinah's immediate recognition of her sister upon entering the common building where Delilah sat, Dinah's cry of joy and anguish combined, and her rushing forward to embrace the twin she had not seen in 12 years, speaking rapidly through tears about how long she had searched, and how she had felt Delilah's suffering across the distance between them. The second account, recorded by a teacher named Elizabeth Morton, who worked at the settlement, focuses on Delilah's response, or rather her complete absence of response, noting that she stood rigid and unmoving as Dinah embraced her, her face showing no recognition, no emotion, no acknowledgement that the woman before her was anyone other than a stranger. The third and most detailed account comes from Dr. Samuel Richards, a physician who volunteered his services at the settlement and who observed the reunion with growing concern. His medical notes, written that same evening, describe the most disturbing aspect of the encounter, that Delilah seemed to look through rather than at her sister, her gaze fixed on some distant point that only she could perceive, and that when Dinah lifted Delilah's sleeve to show her the matching birthmark they both bore on their left shoulders, accidentally scratching the skin in her emotional state, Delilah exhibited no reaction to the pain, no flinch or withdrawal, as though her capacity to feel physical sensation had been surgically removed, along with every other aspect of normal human response. Dr. Richards conducted a brief examination following the reunion and documented findings suggesting psychological damage of an extensive and systematic nature unlike anything he had encountered in his medical practice. In the months following the reunion, Dinah became an important witness for abolitionist organizations seeking to document the full spectrum of slavery's cruelties, providing detailed testimony about her experiences and her sister's transformation that would be published in several anti-slavery periodicals between 1849 and 1850, including The Liberator, the National Anti-Slavery Standard, and Frederick Douglass's paper. Preserved copies of these publications, held in various historical archives, including the Library of Congress, contain Dinah's first-hand account of the separation at auction in 1837, the years she spent wondering about her sister's fate while experiencing what she described as a persistent awareness of Delilah's suffering, and the devastating reality of their reunion 12 years later. Her testimony, recorded by abolitionist writers and published with minimal editorial intervention to preserve the authenticity of her voice, describes her attempts in the weeks following the reunion to reach her sister, mentally and emotionally, speaking to her of their childhood memories, of the bond they had shared, believing that their connection as twins would somehow bridge the distance that trauma had created between them. However, Dinah's account grows increasingly despairing as she describes the gradual realization that no amount of love or patience could restore what had been taken from Delilah, that what Dr. Mordecai had done went far beyond the physical torture and psychological cruelty that were unfortunately common under the institution of slavery. Dinah came to suspect, based on fragments Delilah occasionally murmured in her sleep, and the clinical nature of the scars Dr. Richards had documented on her scalp, that Dr. Mordecai's procedures represented a systematic attempt to destroy personhood itself, to reduce a human being to a breathing shell, through methods that Dinah could only partially understand, but which filled her with horror beyond description. A particularly haunting passage from her testimony, published in The Liberator in November 1849, describes the moment Dinah fully accepted that her sister, while alive and physically recovered, had become an empty vessel. All that made her Delilah, her memories, her personality, her capacity for emotion and connection, seemingly erased through whatever procedures she endured in that isolated plantation house, where Dr. Mordecai pursued his unholy investigations into the boundaries of human consciousness. The fragmentary trail of evidence documenting the remainder of Dinah and Delilah Crane's lives extends across more than a century, pieced together by researchers from census records, death certificates, and the occasional observations of physicians and social workers who encountered the sisters in the decades following their reunion. Census records from 1850, 1860, 1870, 1880, and 1890 show Dinah and Delilah living together in various locations throughout Ohio and later Pennsylvania, with Dinah consistently listed as employed in domestic service or laundry work, while Delilah is noted as having no occupation, her condition apparently making any form of employment impossible. Dinah cared for her sister with unwavering devotion until her own death from pneumonia in January of 1891, at which point Delilah was placed in the care of a charitable institution where she survived for 3 more years, dying in March of 1894 at the age of 66, never having recovered any semblance of her former self. A particularly significant piece of evidence emerged in 1998 when researchers examining the papers of Dr. Abraham Whitmore, a Philadelphia physician who had worked with various charitable organizations, discovered his notes from an examination of Delilah conducted in 1872. Dr. Whitmore describes her as a medical mystery, physically sound with no signs of disease or injury that would account for her condition, yet psychologically absent in ways that suggested deliberate infliction rather than any natural form of mental illness, noting particularly that her responses seemed not diminished but rather systematically removed, as though someone had carefully dismantled the architecture of her personality piece by piece. Modern researchers examining all available evidence in 2015, including Dr. Mordecai's surviving journal entries, witness testimonies, and medical records, theorize that he may have been conducting primitive psychological experiments decades before such practices would be formally studied, employing techniques of prolonged isolation, sensory deprivation, repeated administration of mind-altering substances, and behavioral conditioning that essentially dismantled Delilah's sense of self. Perhaps most haunting are 2 photographs discovered in 2008, dated to approximately 1887, showing the elderly twins seated side by side, their faces still remarkably identical in physical structure, yet utterly different in presence. Dinah's countenance animated with awareness and emotion, while Delilah stares forward with that same terrible emptiness witnesses had documented nearly 4 decades earlier.